The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the group of officers sitting smugly at the defense table, their uniforms crisp, their faces lit with quiet triumph. They had reason to celebrate. For months they'd dodged accusations, buried evidence, and twisted the truth to their advantage. The case against them was crumbling, and they knew it. The prosecutor had stumbled, the witnesses had faltered, and the judge's patience was wearing thin. It was supposed to be their victory lap, the moment they walked out of the courtroom unscathed, their badges still gleaming, their power untouched. But then, she stood up. No one had noticed her before. She'd been sitting quietly in the back row, dressed in an unremarkable gray suit, her face calm, almost disinterested. She didn't look like much, just another spectator, maybe a lawyer or a journalist. But when she rose to her feet, there was something in the way she moved, something deliberate and commanding, that made the room shift. The officers at the defense table exchanged glances, their smirks fading just a little. Who was this woman? And why did she suddenly have the attention of everyone in the room? She walked slowly toward the front, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step echoing like a countdown. The judge frowned, leaning forward. "Ma'am, this is highly irregular. Who are you, and what do you think you're doing?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small black badge, holding it up for the room to see. The gasp was audible. The badge caught the light, the letters clear and unmistakable. FBI. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made the officers freeze in their seats. "My name is Sarah Collins. I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their cameras, the prosecutor's jaw dropped, and the officers at the defense table went pale. One of them, a burly man with a buzz cut, muttered something under his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he was trying to steady himself. Sarah Collins didn't flinch. She turned to face the officers, her gaze sharp, unyielding. "You thought you were untouchable," she said, her voice low but cutting through the chaos. "You thought you could hide behind your badges, your connections, your lies. But you made one mistake. You underestimated me." The tension in the room was electric, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. The officers looked at each other, panic flickering in their eyes. What did she know? What evidence did she have? And how had she been watching them this whole time without them realizing it? Sarah Collins didn't give them answers. Instead, she turned back to the judge, her expression calm but resolute. "Your Honor, I request a recess. There's new evidence that needs to be presented, evidence that will change everything." The judge hesitated, his eyes darting between Sarah and the officers who were now visibly sweating. Finally, he nodded. "Court is adjourned for 1 hour." As the gavel came down, the officers stood up, their movements stiff, their confidence shattered. They whispered furiously to each other, their voices low and frantic. Sarah Collins watched them for a moment, a faint smile playing on her lips. Then she turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a room buzzing with questions, fear, and the unmistakable sense that something big, something explosive, was about to happen. But what was the evidence? How had Sarah Collins, the FBI director, been involved in this case from the shadows? And what would happen when the courtroom reconvened? The officers thought they had won. They thought they were safe. But as they sat there, waiting for the hour to pass, one thing became painfully clear. Their nightmare was just beginning. The hour-long recess felt like an eternity. The officers huddled together in a small, dimly lit room just off the courtroom, their voices hushed but urgent. How did she even get involved in this? One of them, Officer Mark Harris, hissed, pacing back and forth. His hands were trembling, though he tried to hide it by shoving them into his pockets. "We covered our tracks. We made sure there was nothing left for them to find." Another officer, a woman named Lisa Carter, leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "She's the FBI director, Mark. She doesn't just show up for no reason. She's got something. I can feel it." The third officer, a younger man named Jake Reynolds, sat slumped in a chair, his face pale. "What if it's about the money?" he whispered. "What if she found out about the payments?" The room fell silent. The payments. It was the one thing they'd all agreed never to talk about, not even among themselves. Over the past year, they'd been taking bribes from a local crime syndicate in exchange for turning a blind eye to their operations. It had started small, letting a few trucks through a checkpoint, ignoring a suspicious warehouse. But it had quickly escalated. Soon, they were actively helping the syndicate, providing them with information, even tipping them off, about raids. The money had been good, too good to resist. They'd told themselves it was harmless, that they were just playing the system. But now, sitting in that room, the weight of what they'd done was starting to crush them. Meanwhile, Sarah Collins was in a different part of the courthouse, sitting in a quiet office with a stack of files spread out in front of her. She'd been working on this case for months, ever since a tip had come across her desk about a group of corrupt cops in this small town. At first, it had seemed like just another case of bad apples, but the deeper she dug, the more she realized how far the corruption went. It wasn't just a few officers, it was an entire network, with ties to organized crime, local politicians, and even some federal officials. And at the center of it all were those three officers, Harris, Carter, and Reynolds. Sarah leaned back, in her chair, her mind racing. She'd been careful, methodical, building her case piece by piece. She'd planted undercover agents, tapped phones, and followed the money trail. But she knew she had to be patient. If she moved too soon, the whole operation could fall apart. That's why she'd waited until now, until the officers thought they were in the clear to make her move. She wanted them to feel safe, to let their guard down. And it had worked. The look on their faces when she'd revealed who she was, it was priceless. But there was still so much to do. The evidence she had was strong, but it wasn't enough to take down the entire network. She needed more, and she needed it fast. She glanced at the clock. 45 minutes left. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "It's me," she said when the call connected. "I need you to bring in the witness and make sure they're ready to talk." There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, "Understood." Sarah hung up and took a deep breath. This was it, the moment she'd been working toward. But she knew it wasn't going to be easy. The officers were desperate. And desperate, people did desperate things. Back in the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The reporters were buzzing with speculation, their cameras trained on the door, waiting for Sarah to return. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named David Miller, sat at his table, flipping through his notes nervously. He'd been blindsided by Sarah's appearance, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. He'd thought he had the case under control, but now he felt like he was playing catch-up. He glanced over at the defense table where the officer's lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Richard Green, was whispering furiously to his clients. Green looked confident, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He'd been around, long enough to know that when the FBI director showed up, things were about to get messy. As the minutes ticked by, the officers grew more and more anxious. Harris kept glancing at the door, his jaw clenched. Carter was tapping her foot nervously, her eyes darting around the room. Reynolds looked like he was about to be sick. "We need a plan," Harris muttered. "We can't just sit here and wait for her to destroy us." Green shook his head. "The best thing you can do right now is stay calm. Let me handle this. I'll figure out what she's got and how to counter it." But even as he said it, he didn't sound convinced. Finally, the door opened, and the bailiff stepped in. "Court is back in session," he announced. The room fell silent as everyone took their seats. A moment later, Sarah Collins walked in, followed by a man in a dark suit who was holding a thick file. The officers' eyes locked onto the file, their faces pale. What was in it? What did she know? Sarah took her place at the front of the room, her expression calm but determined. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to present new evidence, in this case." The judge nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Proceed." Sarah opened the file and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are bank records," she began, showing a series of large, unexplained deposits into the personal accounts of officers Harris, Carter, and Reynolds over the past year. She handed the documents to the judge, who scanned them quickly, his frown deepening. In addition, Sarah continued, we have testimony from a confidential witness who can confirm that these payments were made in exchange for the officers providing protection and information to a local crime syndicate. The room erupted again, louder this time. The officers looked like they'd been punched in the gut. Harris slammed his fist on the table, his face red with anger. This is bull, he started, but Green cut him off with a sharp look. Your Honor, Green said, standing up, this is highly irregular. We haven't had time to review this so-called evidence or prepare a response. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. I understand your concerns, Counselor, but given the gravity of these allegations, I'm inclined to allow the presentation of this evidence. However, I will grant you a brief recess to review it. As the judge called for another recess, the officers looked at each other, their panic now fully visible. They were trapped, and they knew it. But Sarah Collins wasn't done yet. She had one more card to play, and it was going to change everything. As she gathered her files, she glanced at the officers, her eyes cold and unyielding. You thought you were untouchable, she said quietly, almost to herself. But you were wrong. And with that, she walked out of the courtroom, leaving, behind a storm of chaos and fear. But what was the final piece of evidence? Who was the confidential witness? And how far did the corruption really go? The officers were running out of time, and Sarah Collins was just getting started. The next hour would decide everything, but for now the tension hung thick in the air, unresolved and unbearable. The second recess was even more chaotic than the first. The officers were no longer trying to hide their panic. Harris was pacing. Again his face flushed, while Carter sat slumped in a chair staring at the floor. Reynolds looked like he was on the verge of tears. We're done, he muttered, his voice shaking. She's got everything. We're going to prison. Green, their lawyer, was flipping through the bank records Sarah had presented, his face grim. This is bad, he admitted, running a hand through his silver hair. But it's not over yet. We need to find a way to discredit her evidence, or at least buy ourselves some time. Meanwhile, Sarah was in a private room down the hall, speaking with the man in the dark suit who had accompanied her earlier. His name was Agent Michael Torres, and he'd been working undercover in the crime syndicate for the past 6 months. The witness is ready, Torres said, his voice low. But they're scared. They know what these people are capable of. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. We'll protect them, she said. But we need their testimony. It's the only way to bring down the entire network. Torres hesitated, then added, There's something else. I've been hearing whispers about a mole. Someone inside, the FBI who's been feeding information to the syndicate. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Do you have any idea who it is? Torres shook his head. Not yet. But if it's true, it could explain how the officers knew about the raids before they happened. The revelation sent a chill through Sarah. If there was a mole in her own agency, it meant the corruption went even deeper than she'd thought. She couldn't trust anyone, not until she found out who it was. She glanced at the clock. 20 minutes left. We need to move fast, she said. Get the witness ready, and keep digging into the mole. We can't let this fall apart now. Back in the courtroom, the tension was reaching a boiling point. The reporters were buzzing with speculation, their cameras trained on the door, waiting for Sarah to return. The prosecutor, David Miller, was huddled with his team, trying to make sense of the new evidence. This changes everything, he muttered, flipping through the bank records. If we can tie these payments to the syndicate, we've got them. His assistant, a young woman named Emily, nodded. But we need to be careful. If the officers realize how much we know, they might try to run. At the defense table, Green was still trying to calm his clients. Listen to me, he said, his voice firm. We're not out of options yet. We can challenge the evidence, question the witness's credibility, anything to create doubt. But you need to stay calm. If you panic, it's over. Harris glared at him. Easy for you to say. You're not the one facing life in prison. Green sighed. I'm trying to help you, but I can't do that if you don't trust me. As the minutes ticked by, the officers grew more and more desperate. Carter, who had been silent for most of the recess, suddenly stood up. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice low but urgent. If we stay, we're dead. Either the FBI takes us down or the syndicate does. Harris shook his head. And go where? They'll find us no matter where we hide. Reynolds looked up, his eyes wide with fear. What if we cut a deal? What if we give them someone bigger? Green's eyes narrowed. Who are you talking about? Reynolds hesitated, then whispered a name that made the others freeze. Before they could say more, the bailiff stepped in. Court is back in session, he announced. The room fell silent as everyone took their seats. A moment later, Sarah Collins walked in, followed by Agent Torres and a small, nervous-looking man in a hoodie. The officers' eyes locked onto the man, their faces pale. Who was he? And what did he know? Sarah took her place at the front of the room, her expression calm but determined. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to call my next witness. The judge nodded, his eyes narrowing. Proceed. Sarah turned to the man in the hoodie. Please state your name for the record. The man hesitated, then said, My name is Carlos Mendez. The officers' faces went white. They knew that name. Carlos Mendez was a low-level enforcer for the syndicate, and he knew everything. Sarah began to question Carlos. The officers sat frozen, their panic now fully visible. Carlos's testimony was damning. He described the bribes, the meetings, the way the officers had helped the syndicate operate with impunity. He even named names, implicating not just the officers but several high-ranking officials in the town. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. But just as Sarah was about to ask her final question, the door to the courtroom burst open. A man in a suit rushed in, his face pale. Your Honor, he said, his voice shaking. There's been an incident. One of the jurors has been attacked. The room erupted into chaos. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she exchanged a quick glance with Torres. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was trying to stop the trial, and they were willing to do whatever it took. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. We will take a brief recess to assess the situation, he said, his voice tense. But let me be clear. This trial will continue. No one is above the law. As the room emptied, Sarah stayed behind, her mind racing. The attack on the juror was a message, a warning. But from whom? The syndicate? The mole? Or someone else entirely? She knew one thing. For sure, the stakes had just gotten higher. And if she didn't act fast, the entire case could fall apart. But with so many players in the game, who could she trust? The officers were desperate, the syndicate was ruthless, and the mole was still out there, watching, waiting. The next move would decide everything. But for now, the tension hung thick in the air, unresolved and unbearable. The courtroom was in chaos. The attack on the juror had sent shockwaves through everyone present. Reporters were shouting questions, the officers were whispering furiously to their lawyer, and the judge was trying to maintain order as bailiffs rushed to secure the room. Sarah Collins stood at the front, her mind racing. This wasn't just an attack. It was a calculated move designed to disrupt the trial and send a message. Someone didn't want Carlos Mendez to finish his testimony. Someone didn't want the truth to come out. As the bailiffs escorted the injured juror out of the room, Sarah turned to Agent Torres. We need to tighten security, she said, her voice low but urgent. If they're willing to go after a juror, they'll go after anyone. Torres nodded, his expression grim. I'll get a team on it, but we need to move fast. Whoever's behind this isn't going to stop. Sarah glanced at Carlos, who was sitting in the witness stand, visibly shaken. And we need to keep him safe. He's the key to all of this. Meanwhile, the officers were in a state of panic. Harris was pacing again, his face flushed with anger and fear. This is out of control, he muttered. If they're attacking jurors, what's next, us? Carter sat slumped in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before it's too late." Green, their lawyer, was trying to calm them down, but he looked rattled. "We need to stay focused," he said. "If we panic, we're done. Let me handle this." But the officers weren't listening. Reynolds, who had been silent for most of the trial, suddenly stood up. "I can't do this," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't go to prison. I have a family." Harris grabbed him by the arm, his grip tight. "Sit down," he hissed. "You're not helping." But Reynolds pulled away, his eyes wild with fear. "No, I'm done. I'm not going down for this." Before anyone could stop him, he turned and bolted out of the courtroom, pushing past the bailiffs and disappearing into the hallway. The room erupted again. Green cursed under his breath while Harris and Carter exchanged a look of sheer panic. "What the hell is he doing?" Carter whispered. Harris shook his head, his jaw clenched. "He's going to get us all killed." Outside the courtroom, chaos was spreading. The attack on the juror had triggered a lockdown, and the courthouse was swarming with law enforcement. Sarah and Torres were trying to coordinate the response, but it was clear they were dealing with something far bigger than they'd anticipated. "This isn't just about the officers," Torres said, his voice tense. "This is about the entire network. They're trying to shut this down before we can expose them." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She knew they were running out of time. The longer this went on, the more opportunities the syndicate, or would have to strike. She needed to act fast, but she also needed to be careful. One wrong move and the entire case could collapse. Back in the courtroom, the judge was trying to regain control. "Order!" he shouted, banging his gavel. "We will proceed with this trial. But I am ordering increased security for everyone involved. No one leaves this building until we get to the bottom of this." The officers looked at each other, their panic now fully visible. They were trapped, and they knew it. As the trial resumed, Sarah called Carlos back to the stand. He was visibly shaken, but he nodded when she asked if he was ready to continue. "Carlos," she began, her voice calm but firm, "can you tell us about the payments made to the officers?" Carlos hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "I was there when the money changed hands. They knew what they were doing. They knew it was wrong." The officers' faces went pale as Carlos detailed the meetings, the bribes, and the ways they'd helped the syndicate operate. But just as he was about to name names, the lights in the courtroom flickered, then went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the sound of shouting filled the air. "Stay where you are," a voice shouted. "No one move." Sarah's heart raced as she reached for her phone, using the screen's light to see. "Torres," she called. "What's going on?" But before he could answer, there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Someone was in the courtroom, and they were coming straight for Carlos. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, chairs were being knocked over, and the sound of scuffling filled the air. Sarah tried to make her way to Carlos, but it was impossible to see in the darkness. "Carlos," she shouted, "stay down." But before she could reach him, there was a loud bang, followed by a scream. When the lights finally came back on, the scene was one of utter chaos. Carlos was lying on the floor, clutching his arm, while a man in a black mask was being wrestled to the ground by bailiffs. The officers were still at their table, their faces pale with shock. And in the middle of it all, Sarah stood, her eyes scanning the room, her mind racing. This wasn't just an attack, it was a full-blown assault on the trial. And it was clear now that the stakes were higher than anyone had realized. The syndicate wasn't just trying to protect the officers, they were trying to send a message. No one was safe. Not the jurors, not the witnesses, not even the FBI's. The bailiffs dragged the masked man out of the room. Sarah turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but urgent, "we need to adjourn for the day. This trial cannot continue under these conditions." The judge nodded, his face grim. "Agreed. Court is adjourned until tomorrow. But let me be clear. This trial will continue. No one is above the law." As the room emptied, Sarah stayed behind, her mind racing. The attack had been a warning, a reminder that the people they were dealing with would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But Sarah wasn't going to back down. She knew the truth was within reach, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. But as she looked around the empty courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The syndicate, the mole, the officers, they were all part of a much bigger game, and if Sarah didn't play her cards right, she could lose everything. The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever, and as the clock ticked down to the next day's trial, one thing was clear. The final showdown was coming, but who would come out on top, and at what cost? The answers were just out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. The Sioux courthouse was in lockdown. Every exit was sealed, every hallway patrolled by armed officers. The attack on Carlos Mendez had shaken everyone to their core, and now the building felt like a fortress under siege. Sarah Collins stood in the empty courtroom, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what had just happened. The masked man who had attacked Carlos was in custody, but he wasn't talking. Whoever had sent him was still out there, and Sarah knew they weren't done yet. She turned to Agent Torres, who was standing nearby, his face tense. "We need to find out who that guy is," she said, her voice low but urgent. "And we need to do it fast. If they're willing to go this far, they're not going to stop." Torres nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'll get a team on it, but we need to be careful. If there's a mole in the FBI, they could be watching us right now." Sarah's eyes narrowed. The mole. She hadn't forgotten about that. Whoever it was, they were playing a dangerous game. And they were winning. As Torres left to coordinate with the security team, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she read it. "You're in over your head, Director. Back off or the next attack won't miss." She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who had sent this? The syndicate? The mole? Or someone else entirely? She quickly forwarded the message to Torres, then slipped her phone back into her pocket. Whoever was behind this, they were trying to intimidate her. But Sarah Collins didn't intimidate easily. Meanwhile, the officers were being escorted to a secure holding room, their faces pale with fear. Harris was muttering under his breath, his hands clenched into fists. "This is insane," he said. "We're sitting ducks in here." Carter shook her head, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to get out of here, before it's too late." Green, their lawyer, was trying to calm them down, but even he looked rattled. "We need to stay put," he said. "If we run, it'll only make us look guilty." But the officers weren't listening. They knew they were in danger, and they were desperate to get out. As they sat in the holding room, the tension was unbearable. Reynolds, who had fled the courtroom earlier, was nowhere to be found. Harris and Carter exchanged a look, their panic now fully visible. "Where the hell is he?" Harris muttered. "If he talks, we're done." Carter shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to find him. Before they do." Outside the courthouse, the city was on edge. News of the attack had spread like wildfire, and reporters were camped out on the steps, their cameras trained on the building. The public was demanding answers, and the pressure was mounting. Sarah knew she had to act fast. If she didn't, the entire case could fall apart. She made her way to the secure room where Carlos was being held. He was sitting on a bench, his arm bandaged, his face pale. "Carlos," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to tell me everything. Who sent that guy? Who's behind this?" Carlos hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "But they're not going to stop. They'll kill me if I talk." Sarah knelt down in front of him, her gaze steady. "I can protect you," she said. "But I need your help. Who's pulling the strings?" Carlos looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "There's someone else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone higher up. They call him the Ghost. He's the one who gives the orders, but I've never seen his face. No one has." Sarah's eyes narrowed. The Ghost. It was a name she'd heard before, in whispers and rumors. But no one had ever been able to confirm his existence. If Carlos was telling the truth, it meant the corruption went even deeper than she'd thought. As she left the room, her mind was racing. The Ghost, the mole, the syndicate. They were all connected, and she was running out of time to figure out how. She needed to find Reynolds before the syndicate did. He was the weak link, the one who could crack under pressure. If she could get him to talk, she might finally get the answers she needed. But as she made her way to the security office, her phone buzzed again. It was another text from the unknown number. "Tick-tock, Director. Time's running out." She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Whoever was behind this, they were watching her. They knew her every move, and they were playing for keeps. The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever. And as Sarah prepared for the next move, one thing was clear. The final showdown was coming. But who would come out on top? And at what cost? The answers were just out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. But as she stepped into the security office, she was met with a sight that made her blood run cold. Reynolds was sitting in a chair, his face pale, his hands trembling. And standing behind him was a man in a dark suit, his face hidden in shadow. "Director Collins," the man said, his voice cold and calm. "We need to talk." Sarah's heart raced as she realized who it was. The ghost. He was here, and he wasn't alone. The room was filled with armed men, their guns trained on her. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. But as she looked into the ghost's eyes, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not yet. The tension was at its peak, the stakes higher than ever. And as Sarah prepared to face the ghost, one thing was clear. The final showdown was here. But who would come out on top? And at what cost? The answers were just out of reach, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be revealed. The room was deathly, silent, the air thick with tension. Sarah Collins stood frozen, her eyes locked on the man in the dark suit, the ghost. His face was still hidden in shadow, but his presence was overwhelming. The armed men surrounding her didn't move, their guns trained on her with unwavering precision. Reynolds sat slumped in the chair, his face pale, his hands trembling. He looked like a man who had already given up. "Director Collins," the ghost said again, his voice calm but icy. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long. But this ends now." Sarah's mind raced. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cornered. But she wasn't going down without a fight. "You think you've won," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "But you're wrong. This isn't over." The ghost chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Brave words, but you're in no position to negotiate." He stepped closer, his face still obscured, but Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze. "You've been chasing shadows, Director. But the truth is, you never stood a chance." He gestured to Reynolds, who flinched under his stare. "This man was going to be your key witness, wasn't he? Too bad he's already told me everything." Sarah's heart sank. If Reynolds had talked, it meant the ghost knew every move she'd made, every plan she'd put in place. But she couldn't let him see her fear. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice firm. "If you knew everything, you wouldn't be here. You'd be running." The ghost tilted his head as if considering her words. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of crossing me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. A detonator. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what it was. "You see," the ghost continued, "this courthouse is rigged to blow, and if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to use it." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as Sarah processed his words. The courthouse was filled with innocent people, judges, lawyers, reporters, and bystanders. If the ghost detonated the explosives, the carnage would be unimaginable. She had to think fast. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight. The ghost smiled, though his face remained hidden. "Simple. You call off the trial. You let my officers walk free, and you resign as FBI director. If you do that, I'll let everyone live. If you don't..." He held up the detonator, his thumb hovering over the button. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't let him win. But she also couldn't risk the lives of everyone in the building. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. As she glanced around, The room, her eyes landed on Reynolds. He was still sitting in the chair, his face pale, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of defiance. It was subtle, but it was there. "You're forgetting one thing," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not the only one with leverage." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, holding it up for the ghost to see. On the screen was a live feed of the courthouse security cameras. "I've been recording this entire conversation," she said, "and it's being streamed to every major news outlet in the country. If you press that button, the whole world will see you do it." The ghost froze, his grip tightening on the detonator. For the first time, Sarah saw a crack in his calm facade. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Am I?" Sarah shot back. "Do you really want to take that chance?" The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like it could shatter at any moment. The ghost's men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between him and Sarah. Even Reynolds seemed to hold his breath, his eyes wide with hope. Then, without warning, the door burst open. Agent Torres and a team of armed FBI agents stormed in, their guns drawn. "Freeze!" Torres shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. "Drop your weapons!" The ghost's men hesitated, their eyes darting to their leader. But the ghost didn't move. His grip on the detonator tightened, his thumb hovering over the button. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But if I go down, I'm taking all of you with me." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. She had to act fast. "Torres!" she shouted. "Now!" Before the ghost could react, Torres fired a single shot. The bullet struck the detonator, sending it flying out of the ghost's hand. It clattered to the floor, harmless. The room erupted into chaos as the FBI agents moved in, disarming the ghost's men and securing the room. The ghost himself was tackled to the ground, his face finally revealed as the shadows fell away. Sarah stared at him, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She recognized him instantly. It was Richard Green, the officer's lawyer. The man who had been defending them in court. The man who had been playing both sides all along. "You," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was you." Green smirked, though his face was pale with fear. "You should have stayed out of this, Director," he said. "But I have to admit, you're better than I thought." Sarah didn't respond. She turned to Torres, who was already on the phone, coordinating the evacuation of the courthouse. The explosives had been disarmed, but the building still needed to be cleared. "Get him out of here," she said, gesturing to Green, "and make sure he talks. I want every name, every detail." As Green was led away in handcuffs, Sarah turned to Reynolds, who was still sitting in the chair, his face pale but relieved. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Now it's over." But as she turned to leave, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, Director. See you soon." Sarah stared at the screen, her heart racing. The ghost was in custody, but someone else was still out there. Someone who knew her every move. The tension was still there, lingering in the air like a storm that hadn't quite passed. The main conflict was resolved, but the final twist left the door open for what was to come. Sarah Collins had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and as she stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, she knew one thing for sure. She was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse was finally quiet, the chaos of the last few hours replaced by an eerie calm. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps where reporters had gathered, their cameras still rolling as FBI agents led Richard Green, the man known as the Ghost, to a waiting armored van. Sarah Collins stood on the steps, watching as the man who had orchestrated so much destruction was finally taken away. It should have felt like a victory, but the text on her phone still burned in her mind. "This isn't over, Director. See you soon." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The immediate threat was gone, but the lingering unease was hard to shake. Whoever had sent that text was still out there, watching, waiting. And until she found them, she couldn't truly rest. Inside the courthouse, the cleanup was underway. The explosives had been safely disarmed and the building was being swept for any remaining threats. Agent Torres approached her, his face grim but relieved. "We got him," he said, his voice low. "Green's talking. He's giving us names, locations, everything. We're finally going to take down the entire network." Sarah nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. "What about Reynolds?" she asked. "Is he safe?" Torres nodded. "He's in protective custody. He's scared, but he's cooperating. He knows it's his only chance." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. Reynolds had been a pawn in all of this, just like the officers he'd worked with. They'd all been used, manipulated by Green and the syndicate. But now, thanks to Reynolds' testimony, they had a chance to bring the whole operation crashing down. As the hours passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Green's confession led to a series of raids across the city, targeting the syndicate's operations. Dozens of arrests were made, and millions of dollars in illegal assets were seized. The officers who had been on trial, Harris, Carter, and Reynolds, were all facing life sentences, their once powerful lives reduced to rubble. The public, once skeptical of the case, now hailed Sarah as a hero, but she didn't feel like one. Not yet. The text on her phone was a constant reminder that the fight wasn't over. Whoever had sent it was still out there, and they were dangerous. Sarah knew she couldn't let her guard down. Not now. Not ever. A week later, Sarah sat in her office at FBI headquarters, staring at the mountain of paperwork on her desk. The case had been officially closed, but the fallout was far from over. There were still questions that needed answers, loose ends that needed to be tied up. And then there was the mole. Green had hinted at someone inside the FBI who had been feeding information to the syndicate, but he hadn't given a name. Sarah had her suspicions, but without proof there was nothing she could do. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a call from Torres. "We found something," he said, his voice tense. "You need to see this." Sarah grabbed her coat and headed to the evidence room where Torres was waiting. He led her to a table covered in files, photos, and documents. "We've been going through Green's personal effects," he explained, "and we found this." He handed her a photo. It was a grainy surveillance image of a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured. But Sarah recognized him instantly. It was Deputy Director James Harper, her second in command. Her heart sank as she stared at the photo. Harper had been with the FBI for over 20 years. He was respected, trusted, and had access to some of the agency's most sensitive information. If he was the mole, it would explain how the syndicate had always been one step ahead. It would also explain the text on her phone. "We need to move carefully," Torres said, his voice low. "If Harper's involved, he's dangerous, and he's not going down without a fight." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She had to confront Harper, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed proof, and she needed a plan. "Set up a meeting," she said. "Tell him it's about the case, but make sure we have backup. I don't want to take any chances." The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. Sarah arrived early, her nerves on edge. Harper was already there, sitting at the conference table, his expression calm but unreadable. "Sarah," he said, nodding as she entered. "What's this about?" She took a seat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady. "And I need you to be honest with me." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Of course, what is it?" Sarah slid the photo across the table. Harper's eyes flicked to it, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something, fear, maybe, or guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "What's this?" he asked, his voice calm. "That's you," Sarah said, her gaze never leaving his face. "Meeting with Richard Green, the man known as the Ghost. Care to explain?" Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "That could be anyone." Sarah shook her head. "We have more than just the photo, James. We have bank records, phone logs, everything. You've been feeding information to the syndicate for years. And now it's over." For a long moment, Harper didn't say anything. Then slowly, He smiled. "You always were too smart for your own good," he said. "But you're wrong about one thing, it's not over, not yet." Before Sarah could react, Harper reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. The room erupted into chaos as Torres and the backup team burst in, their guns trained on Harper. But Harper was fast. He grabbed Sarah, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. "Back off," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "Or I'll kill her." Sarah's heart pounded as she felt the cold metal of the gun pressed against her temple. She could hear Torres shouting, but the words were muffled, distant. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She couldn't let Harper win. Not now. Not after everything. With a sudden burst of strength, she elbowed Harper in the ribs, catching him off guard. He stumbled, his grip on the gun loosening. Sarah twisted free, dropping to the ground as Torres and the team opened fire. Harper went down, his body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The room fell silent, the tension slowly dissipating. Sarah stood, her hands trembling as Torres rushed to her side. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." And it was. Harper was dead, the syndicate was dismantled, and the officers who had betrayed their badges were behind bars. The case was closed, the threat neutralized. But as Sarah stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of the battle, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. There would always be another threat, another enemy lurking in the shadows. But for now, she could breathe. For now she had won. As she left the room, her phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're good, Director, but this isn't over. See you soon." Sarah stared at the screen, her heart racing. Whoever was behind the message, they were still out there, and they were watching. But Sarah Collins wasn't afraid. She had faced down the ghost, taken down a mole, and brought a corrupt network to its knees. Whatever came next, she was ready. Because in the end, it wasn't about the battles she fought, it was about the people she protected. And as long as there were people who needed her, she would keep fighting, no matter the cost.